The morning Aaron Archer rode into Duskalo with two children asleep in his wagon and a freshly carved grave marker lashed to the back. Nobody in town looked him in the eye, because grief that raw makes people uncomfortable, and grief paired with responsibility makes them look away entirely. He had been on the road for 11 days from the ruins of the Ridgeback homestead, where his wife Clara had died of lung fever in the dead of winter, leaving behind 7-year-old Nessa and 5-year-old Bram, both of whom still woke in the night calling for a woman who would never come again. Aaron had driven the wagon through snow and mud and frozen creek crossings, stopping only to let the children eat and sleep, eating almost nothing himself, talking to the grave marker on the back of the wagon, the way a man talks to a person when he has run out of anyone else who will listen. Duskalo was a frontier settlement sitting at the edge of the Mossback territory, where the plains broke apart into wild river country and the tree line began in earnest. It had a general store, a smithy, a timber mill, a tavern called the Broken Antler, a circuit preacher who came twice a year, and roughly 240 souls who had carved something out of the hard land through sheer determination and mutual suspicion of anyone from outside. The town sat at a crossroads between the settled eastern reaches and the vast western frontier, where Orc clan territory began, which meant that Duskalo had a relationship with orcs that was complicated, fearful, and occasionally violent. Aaron had a parcel of land 3 miles south of town, a homestead claim he had filed on paper 2 years ago and never lived on, because Clara had wanted to visit her family one last time before the move, and then she had gotten sick, and then the months had gone by the way months do when someone you love is dying. Now the claim was his and the land was there, and the children needed a roof, and the grave marker would go into the frozen ground as soon as the spring thaw came, and Aaron Archer was 28 years old and felt about 106. He set up the homestead over the course of March and into April, working from first light until his hands gave out. The cabin on the property was a rough log structure with a leaking roof and a crumbling chimney, which he repaired with mixed mortar and clay and river stone, working shingles from cedar he split himself. The children helped where they could. Nessa was serious and capable beyond her years, carrying water and tending the small iron stove. Bram was more given to wandering, picking up interesting rocks and watching insects, which Aaron encouraged when he had the energy and redirected when Bram wandered too close to the tree line. The tree line worried him. Everyone in Duskalo said the same thing in the same tone of cautious warning. Stay clear of the deep woods past the Mossback Creek crossing, because that was Orc territory, and Orc territory meant clan patrols and the kind of encounters that ended badly for lone homesteaders. There had been 3 raids on outlying farms in the past 2 years, grain stores burned and livestock taken, part of the ongoing territorial friction that nobody in the eastern settlements had managed to resolve through treaty or force. Most people assumed the raiding was done by the Thornback clan, which controlled the largest stretch of the Mossback wilderness. Nobody actually knew for certain. Nobody from Duskalo had ventured deep enough to find out, and the Orc clans did not send diplomats. Aaron put a heavy bar on the cabin door and taught Nessa how to use the latch from the inside while he was in the fields, and went back to working. He was 2 weeks into proper plowing when the trouble began. It started with a noise from the eastern edge of his property, near the stand of old birch trees that marked the boundary of his claim. He heard it first in the late afternoon, a sound that did not belong in the quiet of the fields, a low and ragged sound, almost like breathing except not quite right for any animal he recognized. He set down the plow handles and walked toward the birches with his hand near the rifle slung across his back, because he was a careful man, not a frightened one, and there was a difference. She was half collapsed against the largest birch tree, barely upright, one hand braced against the pale bark and the other pressed hard against her left side, where the leather of her clothing was dark with dried blood. Aaron stopped walking. His hand stayed near his rifle, but did not reach for it, because what he was looking at was not a threat in any immediate sense. She was an orc woman, clearly, with the broad jaw and the lower tusks that curved up past her lip line, and the deep green cast to her skin that was the color of pine boughs in summer. She was tall, taller than most women he had seen, built with the kind of dense, powerful frame that orc people were known for. But the lines of her face were striking in a way he had not expected, her features carved with a kind of fierce elegance, high broad cheekbones and dark gold eyes that were currently fixed on him, with an expression that was equal parts wariness and exhaustion. She wore travel leathers that had clearly been made with care by someone who knew their craft, a fitted bodice of dark brown leather laced up the front with cord, form-fitting across her shoulders and waist, paired with a cinched leather skirt cut to the knee with slits at the sides for movement, worn over close-fitted leggings of darker hide. She had arm bracers with clan markings stamped into them, and her dark hair was pulled back in a thick braid that had come partly loose from whatever had secured it. Around her neck was a pendant on a cord, a carved piece of bone in a shape he could not identify from this distance. The whole of her clothing spoke to function and pride in equal measure, and it was torn in places and stained with blood and long travel, but the quality of it showed through. She said something. Her voice was low and careful, shaped around sounds that Aaron did not recognize at all, the deep tonal language of the orc clans that sounded to untrained human ears like something halfway between song and stone grinding against stone. She said it again, a short phrase, and he understood none of it. He held up both hands, palms out, and kept his voice level and unhurried. "I am not going to hurt you. You are on my land and you are hurt. I do not know what you are saying, but I am going to come a little closer and have a look at that side of yours." "All right." She watched him with those gold eyes, unblinking and very alert despite her obvious exhaustion, and did not move away when he stepped forward. That was something. He crouched down to her level once he was close enough, bringing his eyes below hers the way he would with a frightened animal, and got a better look at the wound. It was a deep gash, not a puncture, the kind made by a blade or a spear tip dragged along the ribs rather than driven in. Whoever had done it had not been trying to kill her, or they had been trying and had only half succeeded. It had been bound at some point with cloth that had soaked through entirely. He said more to himself than to her, "That needs proper cleaning or you will get rot in it. Come on, I have a cabin." He gestured back toward the homestead, and she followed the gesture with her eyes and then looked back at him. He stood slowly and pointed at himself and said, "Aaron." Then he pointed toward the cabin. She did not respond to his name, but she watched the gesture carefully. He began walking toward the cabin at an unhurried pace, and after a moment he heard the slow, careful sound of footsteps behind him, and when he glanced back she was following, one hand still pressed to her side, her chin up and her expression composed into something that cost her visible effort to maintain. He brought her into the cabin without ceremony. Nessa was at the stove stirring the evening pot, and Bram was sitting on the floor arranging his rocks in a pattern. Only he understood, and both of them looked up when the door opened, and Aaron came in followed by a figure who had to duck through the doorframe. Nessa went very still in the careful way she had, processing. Bram stared openly with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of things that looked different. Aaron said, "She is hurt. I need the boiling water and the cloth from the chest under my bed. Nessa, can you get that for me?" Nessa set down her spoon without a word and went for the chest. Aaron guided the orc woman to the bench near the fire, and she sat, stiffly and with effort. And then Bram walked right up to her and looked up at her with his round brown eyes and said, "What is your name?" She looked down at the small boy looking up at her, and something in her expression shifted, the careful composure cracking just slightly into something surprised and undefended, and she said a word that neither of them understood, soft and short. Bram nodded seriously as if this made perfect sense. Then he pointed at himself and said, "Bram." Then he pointed at his sister. Nessa, then at Aaron, who was already pulling off his coat. Father. The orc woman looked at each of them as Bram named them, and when he said father, she looked at Aaron with those gold eyes, and he looked back at her over the top of Bram's head, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Aaron cleaned her wound that evening, working carefully with boiled water and the clean linen they had been saving for emergencies, using the salve from the medicine tin that he had bought in Duskalo from the apothecary woman, a bitter-smelling green paste that was supposed to fight rot in wounds. She did not make a sound while he worked, even when he knew it had to be causing real pain, which told him something about her. She kept her eyes on the work, watching his hands, and once when she must have expected him to press harder than he did, she looked up at his face with an expression of mild surprise. He gave her the bed that night, which was his, and he took the floor with a folded blanket, and Nessa came to him quietly while the orc woman slept the heavy sleep of the thoroughly exhausted and said, low and serious, "Father, she is an orc." "I know," he said. "Is she safe?" He thought about the question honestly, the way Nessa deserved. "She came here hurt and alone. That does not make her safe or unsafe. It makes her hurt and alone. Go to sleep." Nessa went to sleep because Nessa trusted him, and that trust was the most precious thing he owned. The next morning, Murak Thunderroar was still there. He learned her name over the course of the next 3 days, the way he learned a great many things about her, slowly and through gesture and repetition, and the occasional mutual frustration of two people trying to reach each other across a wall of language. She said her name and pointed at herself, and said it again, and it took him 4 attempts to produce a sound that she acknowledged as close enough, and even then he could feel that he was softening the edges of something that should have been sharper and deeper. Murak. He wrote it down in the margins of his land deed, because he had no other paper, and sounded it out until it felt natural. She could not walk far on the first day or the second, but by the 3rd morning she was moving with purpose through the cabin, observing everything with the systematic attention of someone who was making sense of a foreign place. She studied the stove, and the way the flue worked, and the way Aaron adjusted the damper, and after watching him do it twice, she did it herself without being asked, and got it exactly right. She looked at Nessa's careful stitching on a torn shirt, and watched the girl's hands for several minutes before picking up the needle and thread herself, and finishing the mend with a technique that was different from Nessa's, but just as effective. She catalogued the homestead with her eyes in a way that reminded Aaron of a person conducting a quiet assessment, not of weakness or opportunity, but of understanding, of the basic human, or in this case orc, need to know the shape of the place you are in. She learned Bram's name first, then Nessa's. Then she spent a full day working through variations of father, until Aaron understood she was asking for his name specifically. And he told her, Aaron, and she tried it. And it came out initially as something rounder and more resonant than the flat 2 syllables he was used to, as if his name had been translated into a language that gave it more weight, and he found he did not mind that at all. He did not know what had happened to her. He could see the shape of a story in her physical evidence, the wound that was not from an accident, the quality of her clothing suggesting she was not poor or low-ranked among her people, the way she occasionally looked toward the western tree line with an expression that was difficult to read but was not homesickness. It was something more complicated than homesickness. He did not press her for the story because he did not have the language to receive it, and she did not offer it because she did not have the language to give it, and they both seemed to understand that some things would simply have to wait. What did not wait was the work. The homestead needed to run. The fields needed finishing, and the vegetable garden needed to go in, and there were repairs to the chicken coop, and the fence along the north pasture had 3 broken rails that he had been meaning to address for 2 weeks. Murak came out into the field on the 4th day, moving carefully but deliberately, and picked up one of the split-rail fence pieces, and held it up to him with a question in her eyes, and he showed her where it went, and she set it in place with an ease that reminded him she was considerably stronger than he was in raw physical terms. which she seemed to understand he was noticing, because a brief expression of amusement crossed her face before she moved on to the next broken section. They worked side by side through the morning without speaking much, because there was not much they could say, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that comes between people who are working toward the same end. At midday, Nessa brought out bread and boiled eggs and dried apple slices on a board, and they sat on the grass and ate, and Bram climbed into the space between Murak and Aaron without invitation, and began telling Murak about the rock he had found that morning, which was striped in 3 colors and which he believed was special, holding it up for her inspection. Murak took the rock from him and turned it in her large green hands, and examined it with genuine attention, and then said something in her language, a short, careful phrase, and held it back out to him with what Aaron could only describe as a respectful nod. Bram took it back looking tremendously satisfied. Aaron watched this and felt something happen in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. On the 6th day, Murak pointed at the pendant around her neck and then pointed west, toward the tree line, and said something that was clearly a question. Aaron looked at the tree line and looked back at her and shook his head slowly, not as a refusal but as a warning, and then made a gesture he hoped communicated that going that direction carried danger. She looked at the tree line again with that complicated expression, and then looked back at him, and said something quiet that he could not understand at all. He did not know what she had left in those trees, or what had been done to her before she came to his birch grove. He only knew that she was here now, and the wound in her side was healing, and she had learned his children's names before she had learned his own, and that seemed to him to matter, though he could not have articulated why. He began trying to teach her his language on the 7th day. He started with objects, the way you teach a child, pointing and naming, and she took to it with a ferocious speed that surprised him. She had a mind that was organized and exact, and once she understood a word she did not forget it. By the end of the 2nd week, she had nouns for most of the common things in the cabin and on the homestead, and she had begun stringing them together into approximate sentences that were wrong in their construction but clear in their meaning. And every time he corrected her, she repeated the correction immediately with a precision that suggested she was not just memorizing, but understanding the underlying pattern. He tried to learn her language in return and was much worse at it, which she found funny. He knew she found it funny because she controlled the expression carefully but not quite perfectly, and the 3rd time he mangled a tonal phrase she was teaching him, she turned away, and he could see by the set of her shoulders that she was laughing silently, and he said, "All right, you can laugh out loud. I can tell anyway," and she turned back and looked at him, and the laugh came through her composed face like sun through a gap in cloud, brief and genuine and remarkably warm, and it was the first time he had seen her truly laugh, and he felt it like a hand pressed flat against his sternum. He needed to go into Duskalo for supplies by the end of the 2nd week. The flour was almost gone, and Nessa's shoes needed resoling, and he had promised Bram a length of cord for a project. He did not bring Murak. He did not bring her because he was not yet ready for whatever would happen when he did, because he knew what would happen and he needed more time to think about how to handle it. He told her he would be back before dark, and she nodded, which was a word they had established, and she was standing at the fence line when he drove the wagon out and still there when he came back 4 hours later, sitting on the fence rail with Bram in her lap listening to him describe something at length, and she was looking at the boy's face while he talked with an expression of complete attention. In Duskalo, he had fielded 2 questions about how the homestead was settling, and one from old Gareth Moss at the general store about whether he had seen any orc sign near the tree line lately, because there were rumors of a wounded orc warrior spotted by one of the trappers east of the mossback. Aaron had said he had not seen anything unusual, and had paid for his flour, and left before Gareth could ask any follow-up questions. The trapper's report was going to be a problem eventually. He knew this, and he turned it over in his mind on the drive home and reached no conclusions that made him feel better. And then he got home and saw Murak sitting on the fence rail with Bram in her lap, and he stopped turning it over for a while. Through the third week, she made remarkable strides in his language. She had moved past objects into actions, and then into something approaching full sentences. And while her grammar was still angular and approximate, it was increasingly clear and direct. She asked questions by tilting words up at the end, a habit that seemed to cross the language barrier naturally. She began to tell him things. Small things at first, practical observations about the property, that the north fence needed reinforcing before the next hard frost, that the well was close to a buried spring based on where the moss grew thickest, that the soil at the east edge of the field was too sandy for the kind of planting he was attempting, and he would have better luck with millet than wheat. He asked her how she knew about farming. She looked at him steadily and said, in her halting new words, "My people also have land, also must feed children." She paused and added with a directness that landed like a stone in still water, "You think orc people eat only war?" He said no, and meant it, and she seemed to gauge the truth of it in his face and accept it. He asked her in the fourth week what had happened to her. He asked it carefully, in simple words, leaving her room to decline, and she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the fire in the cabin stove while the children slept. And then she said in her building vocabulary, fragments that he had to piece together but that assembled into a shape he could hold. She had been the daughter of a Thornback clan elder, which he understood to be a position of real significance among her people. There had been an agreement made by the elder, a marriage contract between Murak and a war chief of a neighboring orc clan called the Stoneback, a man she referred to with a word he did not know but whose meaning she conveyed by her expression, which was somewhere between contempt and controlled fear. The Stoneback war chief was powerful and had wanted the alliance with the Thornback clan and had chosen her as the price of it, without her consent, because that was how such things were done in the old ways, and the elder had agreed because the alliance meant security for the whole clan through the coming conflict with the eastern settlements, meaning with people like Aaron. She had refused. She had said no in a context where no was not a word that was recognized as available to her. And then she had run, with only what she could carry, and she had been followed, and one of the war chief's men had put a spear across her ribs before she had managed to get far enough east that they stopped pursuing, because pursuing her into open human territory was a different kind of risk than any of them wanted. She looked at the fire while she told him this, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "They will not come here after you." She looked at him with those gold eyes and said, "You do not know that." "No," he agreed, "but I will not let them take you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" It was a fair question. He thought about it honestly. "Because you came here hurt and alone, and you have been nothing but decent to my children and fair to me in the work. And the fact that someone forced an agreement on you without your consent and then tried to run you down is the kind of wrong that does not require a complicated reason to oppose." He paused. "Also, Bram would not forgive me." She looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and she said, "Bram has good heart." "He has his mother's heart," Aaron said, quietly enough that he almost did not say it. "Your wife," Murak said, which he had told her about in pieces. "She was good. She was the best person I knew," he said. "Before I knew her she was a stranger, and after I knew her the world was bigger. That is what I want for my children, that kind of knowing." Murak was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully and with some effort, "To know the world is bigger. Yes, I understand this thing." He looked at her by the firelight, and she looked back at him, and the silence that came after was full of something he was not ready to name. So he said good night and went to take his place on the floor, and she went to take the bed, and in the dark he lay awake for a while longer than usual. In the 5th week she was fully recovered. The wound had closed cleanly, and the scar would be permanent, but the movement was fully returned, and she was working at the level of any farmhand, which meant that between the two of them the homestead was moving faster than Aaron had projected. She knew things about land and growth that supplemented his knowledge, and he knew things about the tools and the local conditions that supplemented hers, and the combination was effective in a way that felt almost unfair. Bram began calling her Murak with casual ease, stumbling over the pronunciation the way children stumble over new words, working at it until it was close enough, and then using it constantly and loudly. Nessa was slower, more careful, the way Nessa was about everything. But by the middle of the 5th week, Nessa had taken to sitting near Murak in the evenings and showing her the stitching projects she was working on. And Murak paid the same serious attention to Nessa's work that she paid to everything, asking questions in halting words and listening to the answers intently. And Nessa, who did not give her approval easily even to people she had known for years, began to unfold a little under that attention, the way a tightly closed thing unfolds in the right warmth. Aaron watched all of this from the middle distance with the careful awareness of a man who knows that something is happening that he ought to be looking at directly, but keeps approaching at an angle because looking directly still costs him something he has not finished measuring. He went into Duskalo at the beginning of the 6th week for the circuit preacher's semi-annual visit, which was also the occasion of the spring market day, and this time he did not manage to avoid the conversation. It was Gareth Moss who started it, in the open space in front of the trading post, where half the town was gathered for the market stalls and the preacher's sermon, and Gareth had always been a man who talked loudly in public places with the confidence of someone who assumed everyone agreed with him. "Archer," Gareth said, loud enough to carry across 3 stalls. "Word is you have been seen at your place out south with an orc woman." Aaron stopped and turned to face him. The market noise around them dimmed, the way noise dims when people decide a conversation might be worth watching. He said calmly, "She is on my property with my permission." "Your permission," Gareth repeated, with a tone that made the 2 words mean something different than they did on their own. "That is an interesting choice of words for an orc squatting on a homestead claim." "She is not squatting. She is working the land with me, and she is a guest in my home." Aaron kept his voice level and his hands at his sides. "I'm not sure what you think gives you standing in what happens on my claim, Gareth." "What gives me standing," said a different voice, and this one belonged to Cord Halley, who was the closest thing Duskalo had to a town marshal, though his authority was largely informal. A large man in a worn leather coat who managed to stand at the edge of a crowd in a way that made the crowd arrange itself around him. "Is that we had 3 farms raided in 2 years, and the trapper who spotted her said she had thornback markings on her bracers. And the Thornback clan is the outfit we have the most trouble with." Aaron turned to face Cord Halley directly, and a clear space had opened around them in the way a clear space opens when people are watching and do not want to be in the middle. He said she was wounded by her own clan when she ran from a forced marriage arrangement. She is not a raider. She is a woman who was running from something that was being done to her without her consent. There was a murmur in the watching crowd that could have been skepticism or sympathy or both. Cord Halley said, "You got that from her." "I did." "In what language?" "In mine. She is learning it." Halley looked at him for a long moment. Halley was not, to Aaron's knowledge, a cruel man. He was a man who managed a difficult situation the way he knew how, which was carefully and defensively, and Aaron respected that even when he disagreed with it. Halley said, "Archer, I'm not saying put her back in the woods. I am saying bring her into town. Let people see her. Let the situation be visible. That way I am not dealing with rumors and I can actually assess whether what you are telling me is true." Aaron said, "I will bring her in when she is ready." "You will bring her in by the end of this month," Halley said. "That is about as accommodating as I can be." Aaron held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once and went back to his marketing. He told Murak about the exchange that evening. She listened without expression while he explained, in straightforward language, what Halley had said. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "They want to look at me, to decide." "More or less," he said. "I will go," she said. I will not hide in your house. I am not afraid of them looking. He believed her. There was something in her bearing that had always suggested she was not someone who flinched under scrutiny, that whatever had frightened her enough to make her run had been something very specific and personal rather than a general fear of the world. He said, "We will go together. I will be beside you." She looked at him and said, with a precision that suggested she had been working out the words for a while, "You do not have to protect me, Aaron Archer." "I do not need protection," he said. "I know. I want to stand beside you. There is a difference." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched a little longer than he expected, and then she said, "Yes, there is." They went into Duskalo on a Saturday, which was the busiest day, because Murak said she would not come in on a quiet day like something being introduced carefully to avoid causing alarm, and Aaron agreed with that logic and hitched the wagon. Nessa sat between them on the bench and Bram sat in the wagon bed, and they came into town the way they came in from anywhere, down the main road, in daylight, taking their time. The reaction started when they were still 50 yards from the first buildings. A woman hanging laundry in her yard who saw the wagon and stopped moving, standing with a sheet half raised and her eyes wide. A man outside the smithy leaned forward and then said something to the man beside him. By the time Aaron pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, there were perhaps 30 people visible on the main street, and every one of them was looking. Murak stepped down from the wagon bench with the same unhurried composure she brought to everything, and stood on the street of Duskalo in the full morning light. She was striking to look at, and Aaron was aware of seeing her for a moment through the eyes of people who had not been looking at her every day for 6 weeks, the height and the green of her, and the proud set of her jaw, the orc features that were unfamiliar to most of these people. And he was also aware of how the fear on some of those faces made him feel, which was something between angry and fiercely protective in a way he had not fully prepared for. Cord Halley appeared from the direction of the broken antler and came toward them with the measured pace of a man who was being deliberate about being calm, and he stopped 10 feet away and looked at Murak and said, "You understand my language," Murak said, in her clear and slightly angular common tongue. "I understand. I speak. Not perfect. Understanding is better." Halley nodded. He said, "I need to know if you have any intention of bringing trouble from your clan territory down on this settlement." She said, "I left my clan. I will not go back. What they would send after me they would not send here. Too costly to follow a woman into human land. The war chief is proud, not stupid." She paused, then added, "And I am not your problem. I am Aaron Archer's business, on his land. That is where I will stay." There was a murmur from the watching crowd. Gareth Moss, standing near the trading post steps, said loudly, "And what exactly is your arrangement with Aaron Archer? Because a single man with 2 children and an orc woman on his claim is the kind of thing that gives people questions." Aaron said, from beside Murak, his voice carrying across the street without being raised, "My arrangement is that she works my land and lives under my roof, and those are matters for me and my family. I do not recall asking Duskalo for an opinion on my household." Gareth's face reddened. A woman near the well, one of the older women in town, Hester Crane, who was known as something of a force unto herself, said clearly, "Leave the man alone, Gareth. He is not bothering you." She looked at Murak directly and added, "If you are working his land and helping those children, then welcome enough is what I say." It was not a full acceptance. It was one voice from one woman in a crowd of 30 people, and most of those people were still watching with cautious or closed expressions. But it broke something in the atmosphere, shifted it enough that Gareth's posture sagged slightly, and Halley seemed to make a decision of his own, and he looked at Aaron and said, "I will consider the matter closed for now. Keep the land, keep the peace, and there will be no problem from me." Aaron nodded. Murak said to Halley, without warmth but without hostility either, "Thank you." It was the right word, and she had chosen it exactly right. Not deferential but not combative, and Halley heard it and gave her a short nod. They went into the general store, and Nessa bought ribbon for a sewing project, and Bram looked at everything with his usual thoroughness, and Murak stood beside Aaron at the counter while he gave Gareth's wife, who was considerably more civil than her husband, his list of supplies. And nobody in the store said anything out of order, though several people looked longer than was polite, and Aaron chose not to notice. The walk back to the wagon was the last cinematic moment of the morning, if Aaron had thought about it in those terms, which he did not. He thought about it only as the walk back to the wagon, with Nessa's hand in his and Bram running ahead and Murak beside him, tall and composed, her bracered arms at her sides and her dark braid over one shoulder, and the street of Duskalo on either side of them, and him being very aware that he was walking beside her in a way that said something about where he stood, and not caring at all. The summer came in hard and long and burning, the kind of frontier summer that tests the things you have built and finds the flaws in them. They had 3 weeks of drought in July that threatened the corn crop, and Aaron spent 17-hour days carrying water from the well to the field by hand, and Murak worked beside him without complaint through heat that she seemed to handle somewhat better than he did, her green skin darkening slightly in the sun, and between them, they saved most of the corn, though not all of it. It was during those long, hot days that the language between them filled in properly. Necessity is a remarkable teacher. When you need to communicate about specific problems quickly, you learn the words quickly, and by the end of July they could hold real conversations, complex and layered, about the land and the work and the children, and then tentatively about other things, smaller and more personal things, the kinds of conversations that happen between people who are spending their days and evenings in proximity and have run out of things to say about corn. She told him about her childhood in the Thornback camp, which was less brutal than he might have expected and more ordinary. The clan had their warriors and their traditions, but they also had their farmers and their builders and their healers, and she had been apprenticed to the clan healer as a girl, which was where she had learned about wounds and plants, and the difference between a rot that would kill you and one that would not. She was funny about it, which surprised him, describing the older healer she had trained under with a dry, affectionate irreverence that made him laugh, and his laughter seemed to please her in a way she was careful not to show too obviously. He told her about the early years of his marriage, the good years, when the world had felt entirely manageable and full of possibility. He told her about Clara with the care of a man who had not yet put those memories where they belonged, still handling them like fragile objects, but with Murak, he found he could talk about it without the words becoming stones in his throat, because she listened the way she listened to everything, completely and without the slightly uncomfortable sympathy that most people offered, which never quite fit right. She listened as if his grief was a real thing worth taking seriously rather than a problem to be managed. In return, she told him about the Stoneback war chief, and more of that story came out in pieces through the summer, the particular cruelty of a man who had been told he could have something, and then encountered the concept that he could not. She had seen what he had done to others who refused or defied him, and she had known what refusal meant, and she had run anyway, which Aaron thought was one of the bravest things he had heard. He told her so, and she looked at him sideways and said, "It was not brave." "I was terrified." "Those are not opposite things," he said. She considered this for a long moment and then said, "No, I suppose they are not." The first time he touched her in a way that was not practical, not the handoff of a tool or the steadying of a load, was an evening in early August, when they were sitting outside the cabin on the porch bench he had built in June, watching the heat lightening over the western hills, and Bram had fallen asleep against Murak's side with his head on her arm, and Aaron was sitting close enough that their arms were almost touching, and he could feel the warmth of her skin in the hot evening air. He reached over and moved a loose strand of hair away from where it had fallen across her face, a small and automatic gesture, and then became aware of what he had done, and that she had gone very still, and he looked at her and found her looking at him with those gold eyes in the dark, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then Bram shifted in his sleep and made a sound, and the moment changed without breaking entirely. And Aaron moved his hand away, and they both looked back at the heat lightning on the hills. But she did not move away from him. She stayed where she was, with Bram against her side and their arms touching in the warm dark, and after a while Aaron said quietly, "He loves you. He does not love many people this easily." Murak said just as quietly, "He is easy to love in return." Aaron said, "Yes, he is." And then, after a pause that he measured carefully, "He gets that from Clara." "He gets some of it from you," she said just as carefully. He did not respond to that right away. The heat lightning pulsed over the hills. He said after a while, "I am glad you came to my birch trees." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad also." The second time it was a look that lasted long enough to be something more than accidental. Across the table at breakfast, when Nessa was reading aloud from the one book they had, and Bram was making a landscape out of his porridge, and Murak looked up from her bowl and found Aaron already looking at her. And this time neither of them looked away quickly, and Nessa's reading voice went on around them like water around stones. And the morning light came through the cabin window and lay across Murak's face and shoulders, and Aaron felt the thing in his chest that he had been carefully not naming choose this moment to name itself without his permission. He was in love with her. He had been moving toward it since the moment she had followed him across the field, with one hand pressed against her side and her chin up. He had been arriving at it slowly and consistently, and now he had arrived. And it was not a comfortable feeling because it was very large, and because he was not sure what to do with it or what she would make of it, and because there was still the voice in him that said Clara, Clara, Clara in a frequency below conscious thought, and he needed to make peace with that voice before he said anything to anyone. He made peace with it across the rest of August, which is to say he talked to the grave marker he had set up in the corner of the south field under the old oak tree, which was the foolish but necessary ritual of a man who has loved someone and lost them and needs to put it somewhere it can rest. He said to the marker more or less honestly that he was not replacing Clara, that no one could replace Clara, that what he felt for Murak was a different thing growing from a different ground, and that Nessa and Bram loved her, and that the homestead was better and fuller and louder and more alive with her in it, and that he believed Clara, whose heart had always been bigger than anything required, would have found that to be a good thing. He did not know for certain what Clara would have thought. He never would. He chose to believe the generous version and put the rest of it down. There was a night in late August when a late summer storm came through with more violence than usual, the kind of storm that tests a frontier homestead's roof and finds the leaks you had not discovered yet. And the rain came through 2 new places in the shingles, and the lightning was close enough and loud enough to wake both children, who came into the main room where Aaron was managing the leaks with pots, and Murak was already up, moving to the door that was banging against its bar in the wind, bracing it with her shoulder and her considerable weight, while Aaron nailed a board across the frame to hold it. Bram wrapped himself around Nessa, and Nessa put her arms around him, and Murak held the door against the storm with her back to it and her arms spread along the frame. And Aaron drove the last nail and stepped back, and she was right there, a foot away from him, breathing hard from the effort, and the storm was loud around the cabin, and the children were on the floor behind them, and the lantern was swinging on its hook, and she was right there. He said, "Thank you," she said. "It is a good door." He laughed, which was probably not the appropriate response to a door compliment in a storm, and she looked at him with those gold eyes gone warm with the edge of her own amusement. And he reached out and put his hand against her face, against the curve of her jaw that was broader and stronger than a human woman's jaw, and she went very still against the door, the storm loud behind her. He said, "Murak." She said, "Aaron." His name in her voice, round and waited. He kissed her. He did it carefully and honestly, the way he tried to do most things, and she was still for a half-second, and then she was kissing him back, which was not careless either, not rushed, but decided in a way that felt like something that had been decided for a while. And her hands came up and found his face and held it, and the storm roared outside, and the children were quiet behind them, and the lantern swung on its hook, and it was several long moments before they moved apart. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, in a voice that was lower than her usual careful, measured tone, "I have wanted to do that." He said, "I am sorry I made you wait." She said, "You took the time that was right." And then she looked at him steadily and said, with the seriousness that was native to her, "I am not a small thing to want, Aaron Archer, my people, my history, my presence here. This is not a small thing." He said, "I know," she said, "if you want me here, if this is real, then say it is real." He said, "It is real," without hesitation and without any feeling of risk, because when something is true there is no risk in saying it, only relief. She looked at him for a long moment and then she nodded, once, the same way she nodded at things she had decided to accept, and put her forehead against his briefly and gently. And then they both turned to where Bram had fallen asleep again on the floor, and Nessa was watching them with her serious eyes, not alarmed but aware, taking in the situation the way Nessa took in everything, carefully and completely. Aaron said to his daughter, "We should talk about this." Nessa said, "I know." Then she said to Murak, with the particular directness of a child who has decided to be honest, "I am glad you are staying." Murak said, "I am glad also." September brought cooler air and the start of the harvest, which was the real proving of the summer's work. The corn yield was better than Aaron had projected, partly due to Murak's adjustments to the east field planting, and the root vegetables were strong and the hay had gone in well, and the situation on the homestead was, genuinely and without exaggeration, the best it had been since Aaron had arrived. He sold his surplus at the fall market in Duskalo with Murak beside him and Nessa and Bram circling the stalls, and the market was not entirely comfortable, but it was considerably less hostile than the first visit had been, partly because Hester Crane had apparently talked to enough people over the summer to shift the general opinion from fear toward cautious acceptance, and partly because people could see that the Archer homestead was productive and not a source of trouble, which carried a weight of its own in a community that valued practical results. Gareth Moss said nothing to either of them at the market, which was the best outcome Aaron could have hoped for from that direction. On the walk back through the market stalls, Bram grabbed Murak's hand without preamble and dragged her toward a stall selling carved wooden animals, and Aaron watched them from 3 stalls away, his daughter beside him, the two of them looking at a woman they had both come to rely on in entirely different ways, and Nessa said quietly, "She would not leave, would she, even if things were hard?" Aaron said, "No, I do not think she would." Nessa said, "Good," and went to join Bram at the animal stall. The trouble, when it came from the west. It was October, the air gone sharp and the leaves burning on the hillsides, when the 2 Stoneback warriors appeared at the western edge of Aaron's property in the late afternoon. He saw them from the field before they saw him, 2 large figures in the gap of the tree line, standing at the boundary of the old birch grove where Murak had first collapsed, watching the homestead. He did not run or shout. He walked back to the cabin at a measured pace and found Murak at the stove and said, quietly so the children would not hear, "2 warriors at the tree line. I think they are Stoneback." She went very still. Then she moved to the window and looked out across the field, and her face settled into something he had not seen on her before, a hard and controlled readiness that reminded him that she had been born into a warrior culture even if she had chosen a different path within it. She said, "How long have they been there?" "I do not know, I just saw them." She said, "Stay here, both of you." She meant the children. He said, "I am coming with you." She looked at him and recognized that this was not a point of argument and did not argue it, and they went out together. They crossed the field side by side, in the late October light with the birch trees white and bare ahead of them, and the 2 Stoneback figures watching their approach. The warriors were both male, big even by orc standards, armed with heavy spears and wearing the clan markings of the Stoneback on their leathers. They watched Aaron and Murak come toward them with expressions that showed their actual purpose clearly, which was the assessment of threat rather than the offer of violence. One of them spoke to Murak in the orc tongue, and Murak answered in the same language, sharp and direct. The exchange went back and forth for a minute, and Aaron stood beside her, his rifle slung across his back, his hands at his sides and unhurried, watching both warriors with the steady attention of a man who is willing to be here for as long as necessary. The conversation between Murak and the warriors grew heated in a way that Aaron could measure by the volume and sharpness of the tones even without the words. One of the warriors pointed at Aaron with the butt of his spear, which Aaron understood well enough without translation, and Murak's response to that was immediate and definitive, stepping slightly forward and positioning herself in a way that put her between Aaron and the pointed spear, and saying something in a tone that carried very clearly across the language barrier. The warrior lowered the spear. There was another exchange, shorter, and then both warriors looked at Aaron directly and then back at Murak, and said something that sounded final and turned and walked back into the tree line and were gone. Aaron waited a moment. Then he said, "What did they say?" Murak was still watching the tree line. She said, "They came with a message from the war chief. They said he has released the claim on the arrangement. He has taken another agreement with a different clan. They came to say I am released." She paused, "and to see what I had chosen instead." "And what did you tell them I was?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a tone that was carefully steady, "I told them you were my chosen, my family. I told them I had made my own agreement by my own choice with a man of good character, and that the children were mine to care for as much as they were yours." He said, "That is all true." She said, "Yes." And then after a pause, "Is it what you want, to be named as such?" He reached over and took her hand there in the field at the edge of his property where she had first found shelter and held it in both of his and said, "Murak Thunderroar, I want you here. I want you permanently. I want to give you every right this land and this settlement can offer. I want to stand beside you for as long as you will let me." He paused and added quieter, "Will you let me?" She looked at him, and he could see every layer of who she was in her face in that moment, the warrior's daughter and the healer's apprentice, and the woman who had run toward her own freedom and stumbled into his birch trees and learned his children's names before she had learned his, and she said, "Yes, Aaron Archer, I will let you." He kissed her there in the field in the October light, with the birch trees behind them and the farmhouse ahead, and the first few leaves coming down around them. And it was one of those moments that settles into the memory permanently and does not fade. They were married in November, in Duskalo, in a ceremony that was neither fully human nor fully orc in its form, because Murak would not be married without something of her people's traditions being honored, and Aaron would not ask her to be. And the circuit preacher, who was an adaptable man of genuine faith who had seen a great many unusual frontier arrangements in his years on the circuit, agreed to incorporate the elements Murak described. The binding of wrists with a cord braided by the couple themselves, the speaking of the other person's name 3 times in witness, the offering of a carved token, which Murak made from a piece of birch wood and Aaron made from a strip of the cedar shingles he had split for the roof. The witness was Hester Crane, who had decided to be fond of Murak in the characteristically direct way she was fond of anyone she approved of, and Cord Halley, who had come to regard Aaron as a man of his word and Murak as someone he did not need to worry about, and Nessa, who stood very straight and serious in her best dress and held the tokens during the cord binding, and Bram, who had his good rock in his pocket and considered the whole proceeding with satisfied approval. The preacher read the vows and Aaron and Murak repeated them, his in the common tongue and hers in both the common tongue and then again in the orc language, so that the words existed in both worlds, and he bound their wrists with the cord, and Bram said loudly in the middle of the reading, "That is the best knot," which made Hester Crane laugh and the preacher pause and Murak looked down at Bram with a smile that was warm enough to heat the room. Aaron said his wife's name 3 times in witness, Murak Thunderroar. Murak Thunderroar, Murak Thunderroar, and she said his and the cord on their wrists held. That night after the children were settled and the fire was burning low, and the cabin was quiet in the way it goes quiet after a significant day, They lay together for the first time as people who had made promises to each other. And it was the kind of intimacy that is built from months of proximity and trust and gradual honest desire. Slow and warm and full of the specific tenderness of two people who are not new to each other, but are new to this particular version of each other. And there was nothing rushed or desperate in it, only the deep ease of something earned. And when Aaron held her and she held him and the fire cast its warm light through the dark cabin, it felt less like the beginning of something and more like the arrival at something that had always been waiting. He told her he loved her in the dark simply because it was true, and she deserved to hear it said plainly. She said it back to him in both languages, and in her language it was a longer phrase that she had taught him the shape of earlier in the fall, and he had practiced it badly enough that she had laughed every time. But now she said it and it was not funny, it was simply true and very large. Winter on the homestead was different than the previous winter, which Aaron had spent mostly alone with his grief in the rooms of someone else's house, waiting to die of something that would not quite kill him. This winter was crowded and warm and loud in all the right ways, Bram building forts out of firewood that inevitably collapsed dramatically, Nessa teaching herself to read the almanac with Murak's help, because Murak had a surprising relationship with written language, having learned to read the common script from a captured human text that the clan healer had acquired years ago, which was a story that Aaron asked her to tell him 3 separate times because he found it that interesting. Murak learned to bake bread, badly at first and then with improving competence, and Aaron learned to prepare a root dish that was a Thornback staple, which he also learned badly at first, and they ate each other's imperfect cooking with the same good humor. They had disagreements, because 2 strong-willed people on a small frontier homestead in a cold winter will have disagreements about management of the hay store and about the best response to a loose fence board, and about how much latitude Bram should have to wander near the tree line. And the disagreements were real, but they resolved them the way competent adults resolve things, by talking until they found a position they could both hold, and neither of them held onto the disagreement after the resolution, which Aaron thought was one of the most important skills any 2 people could have. He also discovered, over the winter, that Murak had a capacity for playfulness that she had kept somewhat buttoned down in the uncertain early months of her time on the homestead, a dry and observational humor that came out most clearly in the evenings by the fire when the children were with them, and the work of the day was done, and which she aimed with equal measure at herself and at the world around her, and which made the long winter evenings feel like something to look forward to rather than something to endure. The spring brought the second planting and the thaw and the return of the circuit preacher, who stopped at the homestead on his way into town and had supper with them, and talked with Murak about the Orc clan traditions he had encountered in his travels and the parallels he found with elements of his own faith. And the conversation was so engaging that supper ran into dark, and he ended up taking the floor for the night, which he accepted with cheerful gratitude. In April, Murak told Aaron she was expecting their child. She told him in the morning before the children were up, and he sat with the information for a moment while she watched him with her careful gold eyes, gauging his response, and then he stood up from the table and crossed to her and held her with a thoroughness that made her laugh into his shoulder, and he said into her dark hair that he was glad and that he was not afraid and that she was extraordinary, and she said, muffled against him, "You are being dramatic." He said, "I am entitled." She said, "Fine. Be dramatic for 1 minute. Then we must see to the chickens." He laughed and held her for considerably longer than 1 minute, and then they went to see to the chickens. The news spread through Duskhallow with the speed that frontier gossip always spreads, which is to say immediately. The responses were varied, because Duskhallow was a place with varied opinions on everything. Hester Crane said it was a blessing, and sent over a knitted blanket before Murak was showing at all. Gareth Moss said things in the broken antler that Cord Halley told him he needed to stop saying if he wanted to keep his trading license, which had a remarkable calming effect on Gareth's public commentary. Most people landed somewhere in the cautious neutral territory that was the settlement's default position on anything unfamiliar, which was acceptable enough. The summer of their first full year of marriage was warmer and more prosperous than the one before it. The homestead was genuinely working. They had expanded the vegetable garden and added a second field, and acquired 2 more chickens and a second horse named Copper, who took immediately to Murak in a way that Erin found suspicious, and she found entirely expected. Nessa was 10 now and deeply serious about her learning, and Murak, who had appointed herself Nessa's primary academic challenger because she respected the sharpness of the girl's mind, was reading through the almanac with her and had managed to acquire, through Hester Crane's extensive network, a second book, a medical text that was 10 years outdated but still useful, which Nessa and Murak read together in the evenings, with the focused collaboration of 2 people who are well matched in intellectual appetite. Bram was 7 and had accumulated an impressive collection of interesting rocks that had begun to require their own shelf, which Erin built him in August as a combined birthday and because you need a shelf gift. And Bram showed Murak every single addition to the collection with the same serious ceremony he had used with the first striped rock a year and a half ago, and she received every one with the same genuine attention, which Bram took as his due, and Erin took as one of the many things about her that made him deeply grateful. The baby came in November, 1 year after the wedding, born in the cabin with the help of Hester Crane, who had midwifed half the children in Duskalo and was not fazed by anything. It was a boy, which surprised Erin, who had been operating on an intuition that was entirely wrong, and the boy was healthy and loud, and had his mother's green skin and his father's brown eyes, which was a combination that Nessa studied with scientific interest and Bram declared was perfect. They named him Ren, short for nothing and sufficient on its own, Ren Thunderroar Archer. Murak had kept Thunderroar and added Archer to it, and Erin had simply added Thunderroar to his own name privately and without ceremony, because it seemed right that they should share the weight of each other's names, and because Thunderroar suited something in him that plain Archer had never quite captured. Cord Hallie came to see the baby in December, which surprised Erin slightly, and stood in the cabin looking down at the green-skinned, brown-eyed boy in Murak's arms with an expression that was unreadable for a long moment, and then he said, "Healthy," Murak said, "very." Loud. Hallie said, "Good." And then, after a pause, "Archer, I want you to know, I never had a problem with you. Either of you. I had a job to do." Erin said, "I know, Cord." Hallie looked at the baby once more and said, "Strong-looking." It was the highest compliment he had available to offer, given his vocabulary, and Erin appreciated it for what it was. The second year of their marriage brought Duskalo closer to what might charitably be called acceptance, if not quite warmth. The homestead's productivity was visible enough to command respect even from people who would have preferred to have their doubts confirmed, and Murak's occasional visits to town had accumulated enough instances of straightforward, reasonable behavior that the fear that had been attached to her presence had faded in most quarters to something more like the neutral wariness that this settlement kept toward everyone who was not an established quantity, which was fair enough. She began trading at the market stall not just as Erin's wife, but as her own presence, selling the dried herbs and medicinal preparations she had begun producing from the clinic corner of the cabin, which had started as basic remedies for the family, and expanded, as her reputation for healing competence spread, into a modest but real practice. Hester Crane sent her first patient to Murak in the spring of the second year, a trapper with a wound infection that the apothecary had not managed to clear, and Murak treated it with a combination of her training and the herbs she had cultivated, and the infection cleared in a week, and the trapper came back twice to say so and brought 2 of his trail partners who also needed things looked at. By summer, the clinic corner of the cabin had outgrown the cabin, and Erin spent 3 weeks building a second room onto the structure, a proper treatment room with a table and shelves for her preparations and a separate door, And when it was done, Murak walked through it once and then looked at him and said simply, "Aaron," he said. "It needed to be bigger," she said. "You built it while I was sleeping. I started early." She crossed the room and put her arms around him in the broad, solid way she embraced, which always felt to him like being held by the world itself, substantial and warm and entirely certain, and she said into his hair, "You are a very good man." He said into her shoulder, "You make it easy," she laughed. The clinic room was full of morning light. Ren was walking by the time he was 11 months and talking meaningfully by 14 months, which Bram said was because Murak had talked to him constantly while she worked, which was true. He talked in both languages, mixing them freely in the way of a child who does not yet understand they are different things, and Aaron and Murak both answered him in whichever language he used. And Nessa, who had been learning the Orc tongue through Murak's teaching for over a year, was competent enough to join these conversations, and sometimes the cabin sounded like 3 different languages happening at once, which Aaron found chaotic and wonderful. The 3rd year of their marriage brought a second pregnancy, which Murak announced with considerably less tentativeness than the first, looking at Aaron across the breakfast table and saying, "Again," and Aaron said, "Again." And she said, "Again." And this time the information settled immediately into warmth without any interval of sitting with it, because this time he knew exactly what it meant and was entirely ready. The second child was a girl, born in June when the fields were at their greenest and the air smelled like everything growing at once. She had Aaron's brown skin and Murak's gold eyes and a quantity of dark hair from the very first day that made Bram declare she looked like a very small and angry Murak, which Murak said was the greatest compliment she had ever received, and which made Aaron laugh until he had to sit down. They named her Clara. Aaron had not suggested it. Murak had. She had said it simply one evening a week before the birth had said, "If it is a girl, I would like to give her the name of the good woman whose children I love, if you agree." And Aaron had not been able to speak for a moment, and then he had said, "Yes, I agree." Clara Thunderroar was a different person from Ren almost from the beginning, quieter and more observational, watching the world with her gold eyes with the patient assessment that was her mother's exact inheritance. She was Murak's daughter, and everyone who saw them together understood it in the marrow, not just in the physical features but in the fundamental quality of attention, the stillness, the watchfulness, the warmth that lived behind the stillness and came through in moments of decision. In the 4th year, Aaron was asked by Cord Halley to sit on the Settlement Council, which was an informal body of 7 people who made collective decisions about the settlement's governance. He said yes. He also said that his wife's knowledge of Orc clan territory and relations was a resource the council should make use of formally, and after a pause that indicated the idea was being adjusted to, Halley said that was probably true. Murak attended the next council meeting. She sat at the table in the back room of the trading post and was the only Orc person in the room, and possibly the only Orc person who had ever been in this room for this purpose. And she was completely composed. And when the discussion turned to the ongoing territorial tension with the Stoneback clan, which had flared again after a disputed boundary marker, she provided information about Stoneback leadership and priorities that was specific and current, and that none of the other 7 people at the table had. And by the end of the meeting, the question was not whether she should be there, but whether she could come to the next one. She could. She did. By the end of the year, she was a fixture at the monthly meetings, and the settlement's approach to the Orc clan territories east and west had shifted from reflexive defensive hostility to something more nuanced, which did not solve the hard history overnight, but made the immediate situation measurably less tense. And 2 of the farmers on the outer edge of the settlement's lands reported that the incursions on their grain stores had stopped entirely. It was not peace. It was the beginning of the conditions for peace, which is a different and less exciting thing, but considerably more durable. In the 5th year, Bram turned 12 and requested, with the serious formality of a boy who understood that some requests required a certain presentation, that Murak teach him formally what she knew about healing. He had been watching her clinic work for 2 years and had already begun, without being asked, to keep the herb shelves organized in a way that made sense to both of them, and to help her prepare the simpler preparations. Murak looked at him across the clinic table and then at Erin, and Erin shrugged in a way that said the decision was hers, and she turned back to Bram and said, "Every morning, before the field work, 1 hour, you do not skip because you are tired." Bram said, "I will not skip." He did not. He was there every morning, serious and attentive, and by the end of the year he had a genuine foundation that Murak said was better than many adult students she could imagine having, which was not effusive praise from her but which Bram understood correctly as high regard. Nessa was 14 and had decided she wanted to teach, specifically to teach reading and the natural sciences, which in a frontier settlement was a significant ambition that the settlement was not yet structured to support, but which Cord Halley, who had continued to evolve in ways that surprised Erin regularly, said he thought Duskalo would be ready for a proper school within 2 years if the settlement kept growing at its current rate, and that when it happened he would put Nessa's name forward as someone who should run it. Erin told Murak this in the evening and Murak said, "Nessa will run it well." Then she was quiet for a moment and said, "They turned out remarkable." He said they had good teaching. She looked at him with those gold eyes and said, "I mean that you did not break them, that you held on to them through the worst year and brought them here and kept going. That was you, Erin," he said. "It was not only me." She said, "No, but it began with you." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he did often and without ceremony. It had become the most natural gesture in his daily vocabulary, and held it in both of his the way he had held it in the October field 5 years ago when she had agreed to stay. She squeezed his hand back. Ren was 4 and had decided his most important relationship was with Copper the horse, which was a conviction he held with a totality that suggested it was non-negotiable, and which Murak regarded with the fond exasperation of a mother who had not seen this particular personality coming. Clara was 2 and still in the world assessment phase that seemed likely to last her lifetime. The cabin was loud and full and had been expanded twice and still felt smaller than what lived in it. And Erin thought sometimes about the man he had been when he drove into Duskalo with 2 sleeping children and a grave marker, and felt as empty as a spent cartridge. And he looked at the cabin and the clinic and the fields and the 5 people who lived here with him, and felt the scale of the distance he had traveled. The 6th spring brought a letter, arrived via the circuit preacher who had agreed to carry correspondence from the Thornback clan. The letter was in the Orc-written script that Murak could read and Erin could partially read, and it was from the Thornback clan elder, who was not Murak's father. Her father had died the previous winter, which Murak had received as news through a separate channel, and which Erin had held her through in the dark without words, because there were no right words for that. The new elder writing to acknowledge what Murak had built in the eastern settlements, and to request a formal meeting between the Thornback clan leadership and the Duskalo Settlement Council, to discuss terms of a general agreement that might govern their shared use of the Mossback territory. Murak read the letter once and then set it down and looked at Erin and said, "They are asking me to be the bridge," he said. "Are you willing to be?" She looked at the letter for a moment. Then she looked up and the gold of her eyes was very steady and very clear. She said, "I came to this settlement as a wound, as a problem. Now they are asking me to be the answer to a problem that has existed for 40 years. He said, "That is what happens when you are who you are." She looked at him. Then she said quietly, "I could not have done this from the outside, without the land, without the children, without you." He said, "You could have done more of it than you think. But I am glad I got to be part of it." The meeting happened in midsummer, held in the open field south of Duskalo where the land was flat and visible, and there was nowhere to hide anything, which both sides found acceptable. 3 Thornback clan elders came with 2 warriors as escort and met Court Halley and 2 council members and Aaron and Murak, who stood between the 2 groups and spoke first in the common tongue and then in the Orc language and then back again, translating not just words but intentions, not just demands but the fears and needs that were underneath the demands, which was the harder and more important work. It took all day. At no point did anyone raise a weapon. At several points people on both sides said things that had to be carefully reframed by Murak before they could be received without walking away from the table, and she did this work with a precision and patience that Aaron watched with something approaching awe, understanding finally and completely what a remarkable thing she was, what a specific and irreplaceable thing she had made of herself across 30 years of hard living and clear thought. By evening, they had a framework. Not a treaty, not yet, something more modest and more honest, a shared understanding of boundary markers and seasonal use of the mossback waterways, and a commitment to meet again in 6 months and then again after that, which was the beginning of the kind of structure that eventually becomes a treaty if the people involved keep showing up. Aaron sat beside Murak on the wagon seat driving home in the late summer dark, and she was quiet for a long time, the particular quiet of someone who has used everything they had and is now in the stillness that comes after. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they drove home under the stars without speaking, because they had learned over 6 years of shared living that not every moment needs words, and that some of the best ones are simply the ones you are in together. The house was quiet when they got home. Nessa had managed the children and they were all asleep, and Nessa herself was curled in the chair by the stove with the medical text across her knees and also asleep, which was exactly right. And Aaron went and got the blanket from the chest and draped it across her, and she did not stir, and Murak stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at all of it. The sleeping children and the herb shelves and the fire in the stove, and the table where they had eaten 10,000 meals, and the door he had nailed shut in a storm and kissed her against. And her expression was the one he had come to think of as her most true expression, the one that was not composed for any external purpose, but was simply what her face did when she was home and safe, and she knew it. He came to stand beside her. She put her arm around him, the broad, warm weight of it across his shoulders. He leaned into her. He said quietly, "Good day's work." She said, "Yes." He said, "I love you, Murak Thunderroar." She said, "I love you, Aaron Archer." And then, in the Orc tongue, the phrase that he had eventually learned to say correctly after many months of practice, and that she had received the first correct version of with a smile that was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen on her face. He said it back to her in her language, and she heard it and it landed correctly this time, and she turned to look at him with those gold eyes in the firelight. And he thought that whatever he had been before that morning on the road into Duskalo, whatever the man was who drove into a settlement with 2 sleeping children and nothing left in him, he was entirely different now, not because the grief had gone. It had not gone entirely and probably would not, but because something had been built alongside it that was large enough to hold everything, the grief and the joy and the children and the clinic and the treaty framework and the October field and the first kiss against the door in the storm and the carved token and the cord around their wrists and the 3 times he had said her name, Murak Thunderroar. He had said it in witness, and he had meant it, and he went on meaning it every day after in every version of the life they were building together, which was a life made of hard work and clear speech and deep laughter, and the kind of love that does not announce itself but simply continues, season after season. Solid as the fence posts he set in the frozen ground, and the cedar shingles he had split with his own hands, and the cabin that started leaking and was repaired and repaired again, until it held against everything the frontier brought against it. They stood in the cabin in the firelight with the sleeping children around them and the clinic behind them and the fields outside and the mossback territory beyond the fields and the whole wide, complicated world beyond that, and they were home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.